For over 4 decades, Barrie Schwortz has lived with a secret that has tested his faith, challenged his scientific training, and forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about history, religion, and the limits of human understanding.
In 1978, a Jewish photographer from Los Angeles walked into a cathedral in Turin, Italy, expecting to spend 5 days documenting the debunking of a medieval fake. He walked out having witnessed something that no scientist in that room could explain, and 46 years later, he still can't explain it either. His name is Barrie Schwortz. He was the official documenting photographer of the only unrestricted scientific examination ever conducted on the Shroud of Turin, and what he saw through his camera lens didn't confirm a miracle. It didn't confirm a hoax. It confirmed something stranger than both, an object that, by every conventional measure available to modern science, simply should not exist. Barrie Schwortz was born in 1946 and grew up with no particular connection to Christianity or to religious relics. Photography was his world, the technical discipline of light, exposure, and precision. By the mid-1970s, he had built a serious reputation as a technical and scientific photographer, the kind of person hired not for artistic flourish, but for exacting, repeatable accuracy. So when a team of American scientists approached him in 1977 about photographing an investigation into the Shroud of Turin, he didn't think about faith. He thought about the assignment. In his own words, he assumed it was probably a painting, a medieval forgery, a tourist attraction. He had, as he put it, zero religious interest in the project. What interested him was the chance to document a serious scientific investigation of a famous and controversial object. That investigation became known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP for short, and it remains, to this day, the only time in history that a team of scientists was given essentially unrestricted physical access to the cloth. More than 30 researchers took part, physicists connected to national laboratories, chemists from American universities, forensic specialists, textile experts. Christians, Jews, and agnostics worked side by side, bound not by belief, but by curiosity. In October of 1978, they gathered in Turin's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist and spent 5 days and nights, around the clock, running every non-destructive test their equipment could perform. Schwortz's job was to photograph all of it, every sample site, every instrument, every stage of every test, building the only complete visual record that exists of that investigation. It's worth pausing on what the shroud actually is, physically. It's a linen cloth, just over 14 feet long, bearing a faint, sepia-colored image of a man's body, front and back, as though the cloth had been laid lengthwise over a body, with the head at the center fold. That image is what has fascinated and divided scholars, scientists, and believers for centuries. And it's what Schwortz began photographing in extraordinary detail in October 1978. The first anomaly he encountered had to do with how the image sat on the cloth. When you photograph a painting up close, you see the evidence of the hand that made it, brushstrokes, layers of pigment, the buildup of material on the surface. Schwortz found none of that. Under magnification, the image appeared to result from a discoloration of only the very outermost fibers of the linen threads, with no pigment, dye, or paint of any kind detected. Later microscopic analysis by STURP scientists would place the depth of that discoloration at somewhere between 200 and 600 nanometers into the fiber surface, a fraction of the thickness of a human hair. Paint doesn't behave this way. Neither does dye. Both migrate into fabric through capillary action, soaking into the weave. Whatever colored the shroud's fibers did the opposite. It stayed confined to the very outer surface, as if by some process that had nothing to do with brushes or pigments at all. Then there was the ultraviolet testing. Old linen, over centuries, naturally fluoresces under UV light because of the breakdown of organic compounds like lignin. Schwortz photographed the shroud under ultraviolet illumination and found that the background linen fluoresced exactly as expected for cloth of its age. But the image areas, the parts forming the figure of the body, did not fluoresce at all. They appeared darker, as if whatever process created the image had altered the chemistry of those specific fibers in a way that suppressed the normal fluorescence entirely. That's not something a painter applying pigment to the surface of cloth would produce. It pointed toward some kind of chemical alteration of the cellulose itself, localized with remarkable precision to the areas forming the image. The next anomaly is the one most people have actually heard of, even if they don't know the details: the photographic negative property. When Schwortz developed his photographic negatives of the shroud in the darkroom, the image reversed, and in that reversal, a strikingly clear, almost photographic image of a man's face and body emerged, with far more detail and clarity than the naked eye can perceive looking directly at the cloth. What that means is that the image on the shroud itself functions like a photographic negative. Areas that would be raised and catch light, like the bridge of the nose or the forehead, appear dark, while recessed areas, like the eye sockets, appear lighter. That is the reverse of how the human eye perceives light and shadow, and it's the reverse of how painters have worked in every tradition, in every century. For as long as painting has existed, photography itself wasn't invented until the 1820s. If the shroud were a medieval creation from the 1300s, as some later dating would suggest, that leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. How did a craftsman working 6 centuries before the camera was invented produce an image that only reveals its full clarity and correct light values when run through a photographic process that wouldn't exist for 500 years? The third major anomaly involves depth information, literal three-dimensional data encoded in what is otherwise a flat, two-dimensional image. In 1976, 2 years before Stirp's on-site investigation, researchers had used a device called a VP, 8-image analyzer, originally developed for interpreting satellite and planetary imagery for NASA, to process a photograph of the shroud. The VP-8 converts the intensity of light and dark in an image into height, essentially building a relief map based on brightness. When applied to an ordinary photograph, this process produces distorted, meaningless noise, because photographs of paintings or ordinary scenes encode light as it appears visually, not as literal distance measurements. When applied to the shroud, it produced something startling: a coherent three-dimensional relief of a human body. The darker an area of the image, the closer that part of the body appeared to have been to the cloth. The lighter the area, the farther. Schwortz witnessed similar tests and analysis during Stirp's own examination in 1978. This is what researchers call distance mapping, and it's not something that shows up in paintings, sketches, or photographs. Mediums that record how light falls on a scene, not how far away each surface point actually is. The shroud's image behaves as though whatever produced it responded to physical proximity between cloth and body, not to visual light and shadow at all. Taken together, no pigment, no brushstrokes, a discoloration confined to a few hundred nanometers of fiber surface, altered UV fluorescence localized precisely to the image, a photographic negative relationship between light and dark centuries before photography existed, and three-dimensional distance information encoded into a flat image. Schwortz and his Stirp colleagues faced a profile that matched no known artistic technique from any era they could identify, medieval or modern. The team's final published conclusion, after all their testing, was carefully worded. They stated that the image was that of a real human form, a scourged and crucified man, and that it was not the product of an artist. They found what they described as blood-consistent staining containing hemoglobin and testing positive for serum albumin. But they stopped well short of declaring the cloth authentic in a religious sense, or explaining exactly how the image itself had formed. The data ruled out painting. It didn't reveal a mechanism to replace it. That unresolved question is what kept Schwortz involved for the next 4.5 decades. Not evangelism, not faith, but an open scientific question that never got closed. In 1988, a decade after Stirp's fieldwork, the Vatican authorized radiocarbon dating of the cloth. Small samples were cut from one corner and sent to 3 separate, well-regarded laboratories: Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. All 3 returned dates, placing the linen's origin between 1260 and 1390 AD, squarely medieval, more than 1,000 years after the time of Christ. The finding made global headlines as apparent proof the shroud was a forgery. And for Schwortz and his Stirp colleagues, the result was, in his own description, devastating. It seemed to contradict everything the earlier physical and chemical testing had suggested. But in the years that followed, as Schwortz and other researchers examined the sampling and methodology more closely, real and still unresolved questions emerged. The sample was taken from a single corner of the cloth, the same corner that historical records show had been handled most frequently over centuries of public display and repair, and the same general area that had been close to a fire in 1532 that badly damaged part of the shroud, requiring patching and reweaving. Later statistical analysis of the original 1988 data, published by researchers not involved in the original test, pointed to more variation between subsamples than you'd expect from a single, uniformly aged piece of cloth, the kind of variation you might see if the sample contained a mixture of older and newer threads, whether from repair, contamination, or handling residue. None of this proves the cloth is ancient. What it does mean, and what Schwortz has argued for years, is narrower and more careful than either side of the debate tends to admit. The 1988 test dated the specific corner that was sampled. Whether that corner is representative of the cloth as a whole remains, to this day, a genuinely open and scientifically contested question, one that additional testing, using samples from elsewhere on the cloth, could help resolve, but which the custodians in Turin have not permitted since. And underneath the dating argument sits the deeper, unresolved question that never went away regardless of the cloth's age. Nobody, not medieval forgers, not modern scientists with technology Stirp's team could only dream of, has ever successfully replicated the shroud's specific combination of characteristics. Not the superficial fiber discoloration, not the negative image property, not the encoded three-dimensional distance data. Attempts have been made, from radiation-based image theories to contact transfer chemistry, and each has managed to reproduce isolated features of the shroud while failing to reproduce the whole package simultaneously. Schwortz spent the following decades building what has become the primary independent archive on shroud research, a site simply called Shroud.com, gathering peer-reviewed papers, test data, and competing interpretations from both defenders and skeptics of the cloth's authenticity. He has lectured internationally, appeared in numerous documentaries, and testified again and again to a single, disciplined position, that his role is to present evidence, not conclusions. I present the data, he has said. I don't tell people what to believe. The evidence is strange enough without adding interpretation to it. That discipline is, frankly, the most important thing about Schwortz's credibility, and it's worth being honest with you about something before we go further. In recent years, sensational claims have circulated online, including video segments and articles, asserting that new 2022 to 2024 DNA analysis of the shroud revealed genetic sequences that don't match any known human population, or blood from someone with an ancestry that defies human migration patterns. These claims are not supported by any published, peer-reviewed research, and Barrie Schwortz has not made these statements. Some limited DNA work has genuinely been done on dust and debris collected from the shroud during past conservation efforts. Italian researchers published a 2015 study identifying plant and human genetic material consistent with the cloth, having been in contact with people and locations across Europe and the Middle East over its documented history. That is real, published, and interesting in its own modest way. But no legitimate genetic study has ever reported impossible human DNA, and no responsible scientist, Schwortz included, would frame ordinary degraded, mixed, contamination-prone ancient DNA as evidence of a genetic profile outside the bounds of human biology. Real science doesn't work that way, and neither does Schwortz. What is real, and what makes this story compelling without needing any embellishment, is this: an artifact examined by more scientific disciplines over more decades, using more advanced instruments than almost any other archaeological object in existence, still resists a complete explanation. The image formation mechanism remains unknown. The dating remains genuinely contested in scientific literature, not just among religious partisans. And the man who has spent nearly half a century documenting all of it is not a priest, not an apologist, and not a debunker. He is, by his own description, still the same skeptical photographer who walked into that cathedral in 1978 assuming he'd be photographing evidence of a forgery. Barrie Schwortz has said, many times, that he does not know whether the Shroud of Turin wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. He is careful never to claim that. What he will say is that dismissing it outright as an obvious medieval forgery is no longer a position the physical evidence comfortably supports, and that whatever conclusion any of us reach, religious or skeptical, the honest scientific answer, even after 46 years of the most intensive study ever applied to a single artifact, is still, we don't fully know. That admission, not a miracle, not a hoax, just an honest, unresolved mystery, is the real story of Barrie Schwortz's life's work. And it's a story that doesn't need any invented DNA breakthrough to be one of the strangest, most enduring scientific puzzles of the modern era.